Hey guys, Argent Templar here. You know, it's kind of funny. In some ways, as I've moved further and further to the right, I actually find myself becoming more respectful of other people's cultures and more tolerant of them. I guess it's just when you start to kind of take a more traditionalist worldview, and you start to kind of look under, I don't know if you want to call it the veneer, the kind of bourgeoisie materialism, maybe the feminization of modern culture, you start to develop a very different way of looking at the world. You start to develop a very different worldview, and you come to value very different things than what's often historically been kind of the standard. So I hadn't really realized this until I was reading this book, which I recommend because it's excellent, by the way, called Fire and Blood: A History of Mexico. I don't think it's a Game of Thrones reference, but if any country deserves to be called Fire and Blood, it's Mexico. And the first third or so of the book, or maybe first quarter, is about the Aztecs. The Aztecs, the Olmec, the Tlaxcalans, all kind of the early peoples of Mexico. And I kind of find it's often very easy to do one of two things to the Aztecs. To either try to infantilize them, which is what the left does, and take this extremely masculine, aggressive, hierarchical, patriarchal, traditionalist religious society and make them into just these children. There's a page on Facebook called Gaia's Dancing Indigo Children, and that's kind of what I feel like they try to do to groups like the Aztecs. They try to infantilize them. They try to say, oh, they were these wusses who like danced around the trees, and believed in equality, and were just the biggest like pansies possible. And just to infantilize them, to say, oh, the big bad Europeans who were mean went and destroyed this people without any agency. So that's kind of one way to do it, and I've never liked doing that because I just find it's very condescending. It's very it's I think anything that denies people agency and anything that denies that the Aztecs were capable of making their own decisions and having their own culture and just dismisses that. Like you're not even saying that they were barbarians or evil. You're not even granting them that they have the capacity to that. You're just infantilizing them, and it's just a very condescending form of supremacy. Um, it's what it is it's passive aggressive, and I just hate passive aggressive shit. Like if someone wants to do, and this is kind of the other approach that more kind of right wing people do, is they condemn the Aztecs for basically being a race of monsters, which I don't think is entirely untrue. Granted, they believed that if you didn't sacrifice people, the sun wouldn't come up, and so they built an entire empire and an entire political system based on invading countries but not annexing them, and then coming back every couple decades and just harvesting them, so they would always have sacrifices. That's obviously evil. A lot of just the excessive brutality of their society. Everything was punished by brutal death. Um, if you look at the Aztec legal code, the list of things that you could be executed for was a mile long. Very often, these deaths were extremely painful. And I think you can, I don't think it's unfair really to look at them and just say they were a barbaric, bloodthirsty people who worship death. But I kind of find you kind of go beyond that, and once you start to go really far to the right, you start to see there's a lot of things to admire about the Aztecs. The Aztecs were an exceedingly masculine civilization. Everything about their society was geared towards war, towards self mastery, towards kind of a disdain for the material, and kind of an embracement of classical aristocratic values. The Aztecs, to a very deep and extreme level, believed in the immortality of the soul, to the point that they were willing to sacrifice themselves, oftentimes literally, for the good of the state and the good of their gods. It was often considered an honor to be sacrificed to the sun god in the belief that your soul would travel to the afterlife. Now we can dismiss this as primitive superstition, and to some extent it is. To some extent it was very much a very primitive, unphilosophical religion that had just developed based on the realities of Latin America. There wasn't really any abstraction to it, but at the same time, you have to admire, I think, the supreme act of will. Um, the ability to overcome your human self-preservation instinct, not in kind of a self-defeating, kind of feminine way like what Sweden's going through, but in such a masculine way, like saying, "Well, I disdain my flesh. I disdain the physical. I am an immortal soul, and I am so committed to this, and through my will alone, I'm going to submit to being executed, often in the prime of my life. Um, I'm going to go to war and fight the enemies of my state, often in the prime of my life, when I can die and not reproduce, because that is my commitment and that is my culture." And I think there's something very admirable about that. I think, and I've talked about this a number of times. My philosophy is, I kind of agree with Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. That kind of overcoming the limits placed on you by society and kind of becoming an Ubermensch is important, but I think beyond that, you have to subjugate yourself to something greater than yourself. Be it God, be it an idea, be it honor, be it an ideology. Because I think ultimately, since all men must die, all men must serve, and that to embrace power for its own sake is a form of nihilism. So I respect that about the Aztecs and a lot of the other primitive peoples, that their willingness to fight and die for what they believed in. Um, they're very strictly hierarchical, traditionalist, and ordered society. The Aztec society had very strict gender roles. It had class system. It had a what I think a very healthy social order, and one that I think would have civilized more as technology gradually advanced. And I think there is some truth to the idea that a lot of conflict and death is dependent to a certain extent on economic factors. I don't think that's obviously not the biggest or even the primary one, but there is something to be said if you look at historic murder rates in Europe. They declined very rapidly once modern technology made it so no one was starving anymore. So that the average person, even if their life was pretty crappy, they could at least eat. So I think you would have seen that in the Aztec culture. But I do admire that. I was watching Deadliest Warrior the other day, and they had the Apaches and Comanches on. And I would have used to just kind of dismiss these people, just said they're barbarians, they live on horseback, they live in tents, etc. But I found myself just smiling and cheering them on, because just their masculine warrior culture, their get up and go, their get on my horse, go out there, trounce my enemies, and just their pride in it. Even warrior culture aside, I just really respected that they loved their people, that they loved the traditions of their people, and that they didn't apologize for it. They said, "Yeah, we're the Apaches. We kicked ass. They were trying to settle our land. We went in, we shot them. We shot them, or we cut them up, or we did something to them. But that's what we fucking do, because we're men, because we're warriors, etc." And I really respect that kind of aggressive, masculine, traditional society. It's completely different than mine, and I wouldn't want to live in it. But I've begun to see a lot of these people as not being just simple barbarians, not being children, not just being evil, but being other peoples who had legitimately different worldviews. I think their worldviews are wrong, and in many cases were amoral, but it's hard to blame them really for holding them given the time and given their environment. The Aztecs did believe that if they didn't sacrifice hearts, the sun wouldn't rise and the world would end. They lived in an apocalyptic society. And even if ultimately I think what they did was evil and wrong, I have to admire them for having the drive to try and what they saw as preserving the sun, preserving the world order, as it were. So looking at like other societies, I've come to have a lot of respect for the Sikhs. The Sikhs are another extremely masculine, aristocratic, noble people. Their culture is largely based around the idea that the men have to serve. They have to serve in the army. They have to serve in the police force. It's their duty to be patriotic, to fight for their country. And while I don't really support immigration in general, out of most of the kind of the non-white immigrants we have, I do really respect the Sikhs because when they move to a country, that sense of duty carries on, and they try immediately. I think in Britain they tried to form a Sikh regiment, and they said, well, we're British now. Our monarch is the Queen. We are loyal to her. It's not even really a national thing. It's a monarchical thing. Um, their culture is kind of aristocratic in nature. So they say, well, we are the vassals of the Queen. We want to form a regiment to fight on her behalf. And I have a lot of respect for that because that's kind of what a traditional society would do, and that just really shows kind of an understanding of what it is to be a man. I never pretend to be a particularly manly man or an alpha male myself, but my own personal failings and own personal weaknesses don't mean I can't acknowledge ideals. I can't acknowledge what the norm should be. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for the Sikhs, for having such that strong sense of identity, that strong sense of cohesion, that strong warrior spirit, that willingness to fight to defend their way of life and the way they live. I think Europe has lost a lot of that. And I think it's to its detriment. And I'm not saying that you need to have a society where everyone's killing one another. I think in general, peaceful existence is good for people. At the same time, there's no reason to not admire kind of an aggressive, masculine, aristocratic warrior spirit. So this carries on to other countries. The Japanese are a people well acquainted with death. Um, they killed each other for generations in Japan. In duels and stuff, it's fairly common for people to kill one another, and stuff like duels. Committing suicide is very common. Even to this day, it has one of the highest suicides on rates on Earth. But I've come to see that less as something evil, and more as kind of an unfortunate reflection of something that's admirable. I'm gonna have to post that review of 47 Ronin. But in the movie 47 Ronin, basically the Ronin go on a suicide mission so that they can be allowed to commit suicide honorably and die a warrior's death, to die in line with, to fulfill their duty to their lord, to fulfill his last request and his legacy, as it were, and then die like men. And that, to me, is real power. That is real strength. That is, as I said, a traditional aristocratic warrior spirit. And while it may seem absurd, particularly to contemporary Westerners, like, why would you want to kill yourself? Why would you want to do that? To them, it's because they value honor above everything else. And I think even if you don't agree with that, and I don't necessarily agree with it myself, but you have to respect that will. That dedication to duty, that dedication to keeping your word, to enforcing what are generally speaking admirable codes of behavior. And I kind of start to see this in a lot of cultures. I know I was talking to Adam and Iberian the other day, and they were talking about their respect for the Zulus. Now, the Zulus, I'm not going to pretend they didn't commit genocide and they didn't go crazy with witch hunts and stuff like that. But they stated, for whatever its problems, the Zulus were the beginning of a real Cape civilization. It was the beginnings of a traditionalist social order that probably could have, if the British hadn't have interrupted it, developed into a traditional society, something like the Aztecs or the East Asians were able to make. It still would have been very different just because Africans are very different than these other people, but it was going. It was in line. It was progressing, and the British kind of came in and smashed it. And Adam, who is a patriotic Anglo, if I've ever met one, said he thought that was probably the biggest mistake and the worst thing the British Empire ever did was to arrest the growth of the traditional Zulu society. So it's kind of interesting because once you kind of go, I don't know, full red pill, full right, you kind of go from despising these people to having a bit more respect for them. I guess the exception to this is probably Islam, but that's to a certain extent because they have, since the beginning of their religion, been completely obsessed with destroying my people and my civilization. But in general, I find you come to see a lot of barbarism in a much more complicated and nuanced way. You no longer infantilize these peoples, but you see them as kind of these brave warrior cultures that had these deeply held beliefs that even if their manifestations of them were quite horrible, there was something innately noble about the way they functioned. So I just thought that was kind of interesting because they always call us kind of intolerant and stuff, but to a certain extent, I have a lot more real, nuanced admiration for a lot of these cultures than any of these multiculturalists do. So, anyways, this is Argent Templar signing out.